Welcome to our first session. Throughout this study, we will take a deep dive into the life of Martin Luther. Understanding who he was will help us further understand our Lutheran faith. We have all been affected by childhood experiences and world conditions. These things create a framework for who we become. The same can be said of Martin Luther. To understand who he was, we need to understand his early days. Today we will discuss his childhood and the circumstances that contributed to who Luther would become. Let's get started.
Hello. I'm so excited you are joining us to learn more about Martin Luther. I am Sarah, the children's minister at Emmanuel. Before we begin, let's take a look at a few pictures. This is not Martin Luther. This is Martin Luther King Jr. We love this person. He is an absolutely incredible and vital person from American history. But he is not who we are talking about today. This right here is Martin Luther. We're going to hear from him in a little while, and he'll be portrayed by our youth minister, David Box. As we consider Luther's life, there are two main things to consider in his upbringing: his own experiences and the way the world was changing. He was born at the tail end of the Dark Ages. As those times ended, the Renaissance was beginning. Luther was born in 1483 to Hans and Margareta Luther. Hans was a copper miner, which was a very harsh life. To put it into perspective, it is said that the life of a copper miner was even more dangerous than the life of a coal miner. They were at constant risk of landslides, cave-ins, and rising water. They had to work through the constant possibility of a life-threatening disaster. But this wouldn't stop Hans. Remarkably, he was able to rise above his station. That was very unusual in those days, and eventually he started something of a copper enterprise. With partners, he owned 6 copper mines. And as his success grew, his expectations for his son grew as well. He was able to send Luther to school, which was a privilege for those who had limited means. Luther's childhood experiences were not reflective of the average child, but this doesn't mean school was a walk in the park. Those like Luther who were lucky enough to attend school were subject to humiliation and corporal punishment. Coercion and ridicule were go-to forms of discipline. The student who struggled the most throughout their morning routine was required to wear a dunce's cap and was referred to as an ass for the rest of the day. It also wasn't unheard of for the children to be beaten with a rod. From infancy to adulthood, life was hard. Transportation was primitive. This meant that all communities needed to be self-sufficient, and food production regularly failed to meet the demand. More often than not, people did not have their needs met. This led to a lot of violence. Disputes were primarily settled with fists, knives, or clubs. The people, including the church, were hardened by the world conditions. But don't take it from me. Let's hear from Luther.
Life in my early days was brutish and harsh. Cruelty ran abundant, and the needs of the people ran short. This was not just limited to the physical needs, but emotional and spiritual needs were in short supply. The church of my day was not like the church of your day. The average person did not have access to a Bible. Not that the average person could read it anyway. Most of them were illiterate. So they had to rely on what the church was saying. And what the church was saying was wrong. The spirituality of the time was more superstitious. And I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious. It was not well tied to what the Bible actually says. People needed something to hold on to, something to believe in, something to give them hope. So they listened to the church, and they went as far as to gather collections of what they called relics. These were objects that they believed held a connection to Mary or Jesus or one of the saints. Luckily, I had enough nails from the true cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. The church also pushed this idea of purgatory, a place of suffering of the souls of sinners who had died and needed to earn their way into heaven. They peddled the belief that evil spirits were constantly lurking, ready to attack. Everything was dark and heavy, and none of that is found in the Bible. But still, that was the ethos at the time. There was no talk of the life-giving, restorative love of the God that we know. It was all about judgment and impossible expectations of perfection, a relationship with God that was unattainable. The theology at the time was, do your best and God will do the rest, but the people were told by the church that what was within them was bad. Sin, confession, and penance were the primary focus. Salvation was not freely given. It could, however, be bought for a price. It was a time of fire and brimstone, and I didn't like any of it.
I have a grandpa who would always say that you are a product of your environment. Mostly he would say this to my parents in my defense anytime I showed a bit of sass. But in many ways, I find that to be true. The ways we are raised and the ideas present in the world lean heavily into who we will become. That is why focusing on these early days really sets the stage for what is to come in Luther's life. Childhood experiences, world ideas, and faith were drastically different in his days than they are in our own. A harsh world created harsh people. The times and the way people thought were very rigid. There wasn't a lot of room for creativity or free thinking. People were pigeonholed into their positions and statuses. They hardly left. This would go on for generations. But one day, Luther's father broke out of the mold society had set for him. This in turn broke Luther out of his societal mold. They were both looking at the possibility of a life much different from the one previously assigned to them. It turns out they were not the only ones on the brink of something new. The world and the way it operated was about to shift. Big changes were coming. A new dawn was rising. From the dust of the Dark Ages, the Renaissance would rise. The church, however, was not ready for these changes. They would hold on to their former ways with all the strength they could muster, while the world around them was getting brighter. They were still focused on the darkness of sin, penance, and purgatory. This would all stir something within Luther. As he grew older and wiser, he grew more and more unsettled with the church.
We are so happy you have gathered with us to begin learning about the life of Luther. Today we've heard how his early experiences formed who he would become and what he would accomplish. The end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance meant a new way of thinking was possible. The world was starting to change, but the church was not changing with it. Instead, they were continuing practices and teachings that were based more on superstition than on scripture. The church's depiction of God was harsh. They saw God as a judge of people who were all filled with darkness and sin, but Luther was a seed planted in good soil. Scripture would take root in his heart. He would come to learn that ours is a God of love. So let's take some time together now to talk about what we've heard, from Luther's story to the church's story to your story. May God bless you in your conversation.